Kevin Nelson, here's a look at what's going on this week in the news. We begin with news from around the world. Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster has called for prayers for the dead and wounded after the terrorist attack in London. One of the people who died in the attack was 43-year-old Catholic mother Aisha Frady, who was mowed down by the car driven by the attacker on the Westminster Bridge just before the attacker crashed into the railings outside New Palace Yard near Parliament, where he then fatally stabbed a police officer before he was killed by police. Frady was on her way to pick up her two children from St. Mary's of the Angels Primary School when she was killed. Cardinal Nichols asked for prayers for her two children and their father, as well as prayers of compassionate solidarity and of calm for the 40 people injured and police officer Keith Palmer, who was killed. One other person killed in the attack was also on the bridge was Kurt Corcoran, an American from Utah. Pope Francis sent a message to Cardinal Nichols via the Vatican Secretary of State expressing his sadness for those who died and those injured in the attack. Rome Reports has more on the Pope's message.
Vatican Secretary of State Pietro Parolin sent a telegram to the Cardinal of London on behalf of Pope Francis following the latest attack. The Pope expressed his deep sadness and his solidarity with those affected by the tragedy. He says he prays for the victims, their families, and the whole country. The attack came exactly 1 year after the attack at Brussels, which occurred at the start of Holy Week. On that occasion, during one of the main ceremonies, Pope Francis denounced the arms dealers who promote wars and violence for money.
Looking now at news from the Vatican, Cardinal Seán O'Malley of Boston, head of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, gave the opening prayer and address at a day-long seminar this past week at Rome's Pontifical Gregorian University. The seminar gathered together a representative of every office of the Roman Curia, including the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Also in attendance were rectors of pontifical universities and colleges and representatives from the Italian State Police and the Vatican Police. In his remarks, Cardinal Seán said there is simply no justification in our day for failures to enact concrete safeguarding standards for our children, young men and women, and vulnerable adults. He said the Church not only needs to reform and renew its own institutions, but its members also must be witnesses and strong advocates in society. More news now from the Vatican. The Vatican has announced that during a meeting with Cardinal Angelo Amato, prefect of the Congregation for Saints' Causes, Pope Francis approved the recognition of a miracle attributed to the intercession of two of the shepherd children who saw Our Lady of Fatima in 1917, thus paving the way for their canonization. Rome Reports has more on the very short lives of these soon-to-be saints.
Siblings Jacinta and Francisco Marta were illiterate. Their life was typical of humble families in the rural areas of Portugal in the first part of the 20th century. They spent their days in the fields taking care of their herds. Their lives changed, however, with the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, which took place between May and October of 1917. At the time, they were 7 and 9 years old.
It is interesting to see how God, through the Virgin Mary, addressed the children. She used the language of that time, which to us may seem archaic, and she used a language for children. The children were captivated by her message and by Our Lady. They had the capacity to let themselves be captivated.
The first apparition of Our Lady was on May 13th. She told them that she would return on the 13th day of the following month. The message of conversion entrusted to them by the Virgin Mary radically changed their lives and their character. They began to spend much time in prayer, asking for the forgiveness of sins of the world. News of the appearances attracted hundreds of people, but also aroused the suspicions of the local authorities. Francisco, Jacinta, and the other visionary, Lucia, were sequestered by the police.
The Masonry, which had a great influence in Portugal, wanted to convince Jacinta and Francisco to say that the visions of Fatima, of which they had spoken about, were their invention, were their fantasy, and were not real. To convince Jacinta and Francisco to say this, they took Lucia away from them. They told them that they had killed Lucia by putting her in a cauldron of boiling oil, which was false, but they threatened them with the same fate. The children responded, "You can do whatever you want, but we cannot lie. We have seen the Virgin Mary."
The only one of the three visionaries to live to a ripe old age was Lucia. Francisco and Jacinta fell ill and died a few years after the apparitions, in 1919 and 1920, at the age of 9 and 10 years old. Their young age was not an obstacle to their beatification by Pope St. John Paul II in 2000. Before that, only young children who were martyrs had been declared saints.
And the third visionary, Lucia, became a Carmelite nun, died in 2005 at the age of 97. The diocesan phase of the canonization process for Sister Lucia just ended in February of this year. Many people are hoping that Pope Francis will preside over the canonization ceremony of the Martos during his visit to Fatima, May 12th through the 13th. Finally in the news, Cardinal William Keeler, the former Archbishop of Baltimore, has passed away at the age of 86. He died at his residence at St. Martin's Home for the Aged. Cardinal Keeler was the Bishop of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when he was appointed the 14th Archbishop of Baltimore in 1989. Pope John Paul II made him a cardinal in 1994, and he retired in 2007. The cardinal was an international leader in Catholic-Jewish relations and the driving force behind the restoration of America's first cathedral. The Archdiocese said the cardinal will lie in repose March 27th at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Assumption in Baltimore. His funeral will be celebrated March 28th at the Cathedral of Mary, our Queen. Well, that's all the information we have for you this time. I'm Kevin Nelson. Don't forget, you can keep up to date on Catholic news throughout the week with Catholic Newsbreak right here on the Catholic TV network.